Israeli society has been radicalized for years, long before October 7, where you have a situation where it's incredibly mainstream to not view Palestinians as equal.
In recent months, multiple images and videos have been posted on social media by Israeli soldiers in Gaza, in which they mock Palestinians or show off how they abuse them, often met with positive reactions from a large number of Israeli social media users. Middle East Eye spoke to Antony Loewenstein, an Australian-German independent investigative journalist, author and filmmaker, who recently wrote an article about this phenomenon titled "Israelis are celebrating mass slaughter in Gaza."
The dehumanization of Palestinians within Israel started, of course, long before October 7, and really there's been a case for years, before social media, of Israelis celebrating when Palestinians are killed. Now, when I say, I don't mean every single Israeli, of course, but what I mean is that it's incredibly mainstream, disturbingly so, to dehumanize Palestinians, to not regard them as equal. And you know that because I spent time there, lived there for a long time, and also because they barely feature in the media. I mean, Palestinian voices, Palestinian ideas, Palestinians are rarely, if ever, heard. Fast forward to October 7 and the last 9 months or so, and what you've seen is this explosion, this unfortunate confluence of both the massive explosion of social media, TikTok, Instagram, etc. in the last years, and the idea that Israelis feel complete impunity to behave and act as they have for years, not often in front of cameras or mobile phones, but now they can. So what I've been seeing for months really is everything from Palestinians who have been tortured, Palestinians who are being tied up, obviously, who have been abused, sometimes with physical evidence of that abuse. I've seen a lot of Israeli soldiers mocking Palestinians starving. I've seen a lot of Israeli soldiers obviously parading around with women's lingerie. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And how is that viewed in Israeli society? Firstly, it's barely commented on. I mean, in the West, or at least some parts of the West, this is scandalous. In Israel, there's no scandal. There is no scandal. There obviously are some who oppose what's going on. Of course there are within Israel, but in general, tragically, as I've been saying for a long time, Israeli society has been radicalized for years, long before October 7, where you have a situation where it's incredibly mainstream to not view Palestinians as equal, and this Western obsession since October 7, but before Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the prime minister, of course, he's responsible, and I think he's an awful criminal who obviously is ultimately responsible for what's happening in Gaza and what failed on October 7 to allow this Hamas attack to happen, for sure. But it's a delusion to believe that if he falls as prime minister, the likely replacements, Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, others, Benny Gantz, on all these key issues, they're remarkably similar on Gaza, on the occupation, on settlements. And this is because this is mainstream. Now, Netanyahu gave an interview a few months ago on, I think it was American TV, where he sort of said, I'm speaking for the majority of Israelis. And although he's not personally hugely popular anymore, what he said actually is sadly true, that many Israelis do have those views about Palestinians. And that's the tragic situation that Israel finds itself in, and it's getting worse and worse by the week.
In the press, particularly in the West, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government are often labelled as fringe or extremist. But Antony Loewenstein argues that Netanyahu says things that many in Israeli society believe and feel, even those that don't personally support him. We asked him why he thinks the media describes Netanyahu's government in this way.
I think many in the West, and when I say the West, I mean many in the Western press and politicians, they regard Israel as a separate case. If we're talking about Russia, it's incredibly uncontroversial to say Putin is a thug, Putin is a war criminal, the invasion of Ukraine is wrong, all of which I agree with. It's undeniably true. And yet when it comes to Israel, well, it's more complicated. Who can say? Netanyahu was elected by the people, which is undeniably true. He was. Putin really was not. And I think the difference is that Israel is the ultimate exception. I mean, I've said for a long time that much of the Western press has provided cover for Israeli actions and crimes for years, long, long, long before October 7. this is in the US particularly, but also in the UK and elsewhere, where there's either an acceptance of Israeli behavior in much of the Western elites. The occupation either doesn't exist, or it's not really much of a problem, or we can overlook it. I mean, the EU is Israel's largest trading partner. That's been the case forever. Israel sells weapons to the EU, vice versa. None of that, by the way, is likely to stop because of the last 9 months, because of the genocide, because of the mass slaughter of Palestinians. There are some European states that undeniably are upset, mostly 3, Belgium, Ireland, and Spain. Although what they're calling for a Palestinian state, although it's nice on paper, it doesn't really mean anything. I don't even know what it actually means. The Palestinian Authority, as the potential leader of that imaginary state, is a deeply corrupt, unrepresentative group. So no one quite knows what those 3 states mean. It's better than not talking about Palestine. I think it seems more like lip service to me. But I think in many ways, Israel has been granted this impunity, both legally and morally, for years, because I think for a lot of people in the West, Jewish and non-Jewish, and I say this as someone Jewish myself, I think there is a willingness to overlook or claim the settlers are fringe in Israel. Netanyahu is partnered with extremists. Now, that is true. Netanyahu's government is particularly extreme compared to previous governments. However, the settlements have been going for over half a century. In fact, often over the last 30 years, settlements increased under Labour governments there, the supposed left-wing government in Israel. And I think what that radicalisation I spoke about before of Israeli society does not mean that every single Israeli supports the settlers. They don't. But the settler movement, which is a sizable minority moving towards majority, has successfully infiltrated the state. Every level, military, governmental, bureaucracy, the police. And what that means is that when a very extreme government comes in, Netanyahu in the last year and a half, the systems are in place for profound abuse. In other words, what you see in the West Bank, this increasing collusion between settlers and soldiers, which has been going on for years. I saw that myself when I first visited Palestine in 2005. I've been going there for many years since, and I lived there for a long time from 2016 to 2020. And I saw this with my own eyes. I mean, the settlers and soldiers are, for Palestinians, they make no difference. They're both as bad as each other. And I think finally now, for the first time since October 7, because of the last 9 months of mass slaughter, finally there is an awareness in some circles, though far from enough, that this is Israel. This is not some fringe minority that's suddenly off the leash, that's suddenly committing genocide. Netanyahu itself is representing a sizable proportion of the population. And let's be clear, to finish on this point, public opinion polls for months have shown massive support for the war. In fact, often at times, the polls have said that Israelis think there should be more force in Gaza. And that's only because Gazans don't exist. Their voices are not heard, their suffering is not seen. I mean, you saw these images of settlers literally trying to stop food getting into Gaza. Now, again, in the West, that's easy to frame as extreme behavior by a small minority. It is a sizable minority, if not an increasing majority in Israel, that believes that Palestinians should starve to death. And to sort of hear that, I think for a lot of people is shocking. And let me just finish on this one point. I think there is still this deep discomfort in the West to actually believe that Jews would be doing this to others. Because of Jewish history, because of the suffering that Jews have experienced, including my family, most of whom were killed in the Holocaust in World War II by the Nazis, there is this still, I would say, willful blindness to accept the fact that there are Jews, Israelis, and many in the Jewish diaspora who support this, who are openly and determined to oppress Palestinians, to kill Palestinians. It's so easy to sort of say there's Muslim extremists, there's ISIS. And yes, Muslim extremism is a reality. I'm not denying that. But how often do we talk about Jewish extremism? Jewish extremism runs the state. The Israeli state is an extremist government for years. I think many in the West blindly refuse to see that reality, although it is changing.
Since television became mainstream, images and footage of atrocities carried out by soldiers in major wars often made their way back home, starting with the Vietnam War, and would fuel the anti-war movements and protests that were instrumental in ending many wars. We asked Loewenstein if the images coming from Gaza have similarly unsettled some Israelis and whether they have sparked anti-war protests.
And there's certainly a growing number of Israelis who oppose the war, but not because of what they're seeing on TikTok or Instagram. I mean, as I said, that is because there is a growing sense in Israel that the war is seemingly unwinnable and many Israeli hostages are likely dead. I mean, we don't know how many are alive. The latest figures we have may be 50, which is tiny compared to how many obviously were taken on October 7. Look, I think there is this pathological belief within Israeli society, which begins at a young age, from kindergarten, from school, from university, from the media. And I have Israeli Jewish friends of mine who do not subscribe to these views who talk about this. I mean, Gideon Levy is a very famous Israeli journalist. He's a friend of mine, a real inspiration. He, of course, does not subscribe to that view. And he regularly says for years, he's been writing about the occupation for 30 years, but since October 7, explains that for Israeli Jews, not all, but a sizable majority, Palestinians don't exist. They're an inconvenience. I mean, I'm seeing on Israeli television literally daily this idea on mainstream TV, commentators talking about we should, as Israelis, bomb them more. We should wipe all of Gaza out. Now, obviously, there are extremists in the US, in Turkey, in Europe, in my country, Australia. Of course, in every country there is. But this is not a fringe view. This is a mainstream view. And it's why Israeli friends of mine and obviously Palestinians have said for years, and that feeling has only strengthened since October 7, the change that needs to happen in Israel will not happen from within. In other words, there are obviously Israeli Jews who oppose what's going on. They protest. I'm not talking about the main protests we've seen the last year and a half. Most of those people do not oppose the occupation, to be clear. They oppose an element of the government trying to push through a quite radical reform, so-called reform to the Supreme Court there, the High Court. But there is a sense that without outside pressure, sanctions, boycotts, divestments, like what happened with South African apartheid to end that regime in 1994, this will not change. There is not the constituency within Israel to change that. And there's no indication since October 7, because many Israelis, and frankly, many Jews in the diaspora feel, and again, it's a complicated picture, many young Jews in the diaspora now, thankfully, are increasingly speaking out, being critical, calling for a ceasefire, calling for sanctions, boycotts, talking about anti-Zionism, things that many of us have discussed for years. And I say, welcome people, come into the team. But the fact is that many Jews in Israel and the Jewish diaspora have doubled down into that hardline patriotism and hatred of Arabs and Palestinians, which is why without outside pressure, this situation, I fear, will not change.
In his article, Loewenstein mentions the need to de-radicalize Israeli society and its Western supporters through outside pressure, primarily in the form of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. While sanctions significantly pressured the apartheid government in South Africa and were instrumental in its downfall, some other nations that have been on the receiving end of sanctions have seemingly united over the perceived persecution by the rest of the world and held on through hard times so far. We asked Loewenstein if there is a risk that targeting Israel with boycotts and sanctions could further radicalize members of its society if they feel increasingly isolated from the rest of the world.
I think it's possible that victimhood would be on steroids. I do think that's possible, as it was with white South Africans years ago too, when they said the whole world's against us, we're just trying to create this beautiful white ethno-state. Why is everyone getting so upset about it? Sanctions are a very blunt and often inaccurate tool. And what I mean by that is that there's been sanctions, for example, on Russia since February 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, Russia's economy is doing pretty well. I mean, it's a deeply repressive state, let's be clear. But free speech doesn't really exist. So I'm not by any means idealizing Russia, but economically, the Western sanctions have been a bit of a failure, to be honest. I think there really is a sense that when I say sanctions, divestment and boycotts of Israel, that can mean a range of things. It could mean, for example, that growing numbers of musicians, artists do not play in Israel, do not associate with Israeli institutions. I mean, it talks about trying to not anymore support and buy Israeli weapons. I mean, my last book was the Palestine Laboratory, which talked all about the Israeli arms industry. And just last week, in fact, Israel released its figures for 2023. They were the highest ever, 13.1 billion US dollars. The arms industry is soaring. And I'd be relatively confident that come the figures for this year, which we get in about a year's time, those figures would also be very, very good, because a lot of nations, particularly in Europe and elsewhere, are desperate for Israeli weapons, missile defense, shields, etc. But I think boycotts also can be effective in terms of, say, and I have a number of Israeli legal friends who are pushing the EU to make it impossible for huge amounts of settlers to travel to the EU, to go on holiday in Greece. Now, these might not seem like things to bring down the state. They're not. But they show that what Israel is doing is not okay. It is not acceptable to be a radical racist settler and think it's okay to somehow go to Cyprus for your summer holidays. It is not okay. And the US, the UK, Australia has started sanctioning a handful of the most extreme settlers, which I welcome. That needs to go far, far greater, because obviously the issue is not a handful of people. It's the fact that the Israeli state is supporting and backing and funding these settlers. So, look, Israeli victimhood is, and frankly Jewish victimhood, is a major problem. No one denies, clearly, least of all someone like myself as a Jew, that Jews have not been victims in history. That's undeniably true. But as you rightly say, since October 7, the fact of the matter is that there's been 40 to 50,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority of whom are civilians. And the bottom line is none of this is making Israelis safer. In fact, it's the opposite. All these actions that Israel has been doing, these massacres, this genocide for 9 months, has actually made Israel's position far more precarious in the Middle East. Far more precarious. And I would argue Jewish life in the West far more precarious, because many, many people who are not Jewish see Israel, a Jewish state, massacring Palestinians day after day after day. They're seeing it on their social media feeds all the time. And Israel claims that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is nonsense, but that's what they claim. And therefore, that is undeniably increasing anti-Semitism. Not that it justifies any anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is a real problem, and it is growing in parts of the world, because too often Israel claims to speak for all Jews. It doesn't speak for me, it doesn't speak for huge amounts of Jews around the world, but it claims to speak for all of us, that someone Netanyahu is our dear leader. I mean, it's an absurd proposition, but that's how he often frames himself. And I worry that that victimhood will increase. But again, the only way this will change to me is if Israelis feel economic pain. Victimhood might go up in the short term, but in the end, Israel has to be given a choice. You either reform or the boycotts and sanctions get harder.
Despite the fact that some of the images shared by Israeli soldiers from Gaza have been presented as evidence by South Africa in their genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, Israeli soldiers have continued sharing such content on social media. We asked Loewenstein why he thinks the Israeli leadership hasn't instructed their troops to refrain from posting this type of content after it had been used as evidence against them.
Because they don't care and they support it. I mean, we get told that Israel is the most moral army in the world. I mean, the fact that anyone can believe that, you have to be on crack to actually believe that concept. That there is this idea somehow that we're told all militaries have rules of engagement, they have certain conduct that's not acceptable. Look, every military by definition is immoral, in my view. Now, what I mean by it doesn't mean every single soldier is immoral. What I mean is that the actions, if you go into Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, the list goes on. By definition, you are an unwelcome force and you will commit abuses because you're dealing with the local population that hates you with a passion. And we saw that in insurgency after insurgency after insurgency. Israel has learned nothing, seemingly, like the US has learned literally nothing from any of their own insurgencies in the last half century. I think these things continue to happen because there's been not one Israeli soldier, general, politician ever held to account. Not one. Literally not one. Now, obviously, the International Criminal Court in a frankly pretty surprising decision recently, because the ICC, although they've prosecuted some horrible people in the last 20 years, have never gone after Western leaders. So I was pleased that they actually did, or trying to do so. Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister. Now, obviously, if people like that end up in The Hague on trial, and I think it's very possible that you will see in the coming months and years large numbers of states, probably in the global south, using those videos of Israelis on TikTok showing their own abuses as trying to prosecute those people, to try to find them for arrest warrants. I can imagine that happening quite likely, actually. And a number of states have been saying, if you, as a dual citizen, have fought in Gaza, there are lots of American Jews fighting in Gaza, there are Aussie, Australian Jews fighting in Gaza. They have two passports, an Australian and an Israeli passport. Why shouldn't they be investigated for potential war crimes? Now, is the US or Australia likely to do that in the short term? Possibly not. But South Africa said that they would. They have said very clearly that if South African Jews are found to have committed war crimes in South Africa, we will prosecute you. And rightly so. This is what impunity does, right? It shows you that you have no reason to fear any international or frankly domestic legal body, because no one is challenging you. So the rules of engagement in the IDF, to say they're lax would be very generous. They are close to non-existent, because we've seen for years and years and years countless examples in Gaza, in the West Bank and Israel itself, of Israeli soldiers, police, just abusing Palestinians, killing them, maiming them, shooting them, attacking them. Nothing happens. They get a slap on the wrist at best.
Although relations between some Western nations and Israel have strained over Israel's conduct in Gaza, Israel continues to receive support from its key allies. Events previously described as a red line by US President Joe Biden, such as an invasion of Rafah, have been crossed with little to no consequences for Israel. We asked Loewenstein where he thinks Western nations would draw the line, if at all.
I don't think there is a red line, tragically. I mean, it's clear from the US perspective that that red line does not exist. I mean, I think too much the media has indulged Biden for, frankly, 9 months, and many of his administration expressing concern about deaths in Gaza as if they care. I mean, they're still pumping the weapons into Israel. That's all that matters. And now we're seeing that if there's a, God forbid, conflict between Israel and Lebanon, Hezbollah, that the US, of course, will be by Israel's side. I mean, the implication there, frankly, is that Israel could not potentially fight that war on its own. That there is the real possibility, as I'm reading in Israeli press regularly, of a three-front war: Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon. Now, obviously, I would not want that ever. I think it would be utterly disastrous, particularly Israel and Lebanon. But there are no red lines. There are no red lines because for many in the Western elites, Palestinians don't exist. They're treated as an afterthought at best. They are given lip service. We're deeply concerned about Palestinian suffering. Please, Israel, allow more aid in. Build an absurd pier, which is about to be abandoned because it's brought in about, 2 loaves of bread in 3 months. I mean, this thing is just a disgusting farce. And I fear that even if 100,000, 500,000, 1 million Palestinians had been killed in Gaza, God forbid, I don't believe there would be a red line for Biden, or frankly the UK, or much of Europe, or for that matter, my country, Australia. I don't think there's a red line. And I think for a lot of people in the West, but also in the global South, this is a deeply clarifying moment, that if you can kill so many Palestinians, essentially without any kind of accountability or being stopped, then how dare you, Washington, talk about values and human rights in Ukraine or Congo or Sudan or wherever it may be? We, as much of the global community, will regard you, America, whether it's Trump or Biden, as you say, on these key issues, they're frankly as bad as each other. I mean, it's important to know that Trump has not been president for the last 4 years. And had Trump been president since October 7, I think it's pretty clear that Israel's behavior would have been just as bad, if not worse. I think there's no real doubt about that in my mind. And the only real hope, I think, to change that is to I guess, will frankly not vote for either of them, but to actually build civil society pressure. I mean, South African apartheid did not end because US leaders one day woke up and said, gee, apartheid's terrible. It was civil society campaigns for years and years and years. Sports boycotts, music boycotts, economic boycotts. That is what is required here. It's not going to be led by Trump or Biden, obviously, or Keir Starmer, the likely next UK Prime Minister. I mean, they've been complicit in this whole process, frankly. So the lack of red lines for the Western elites, and frankly, many in the media, has been a deeply clarifying moment to many people. I mean, I was always, sadly, fairly convinced that there would be no red lines, and I was very fearful. I talk about this at the end of my book, which came out before October 7, that I feared a moment. I didn't predict October 7, but I feared a moment, a war, an event, some horrible event that would trigger a so-called justification for what Israel is doing, mass ethnic cleansing, to continue, as Israel openly says, to finish what they started in 1948. And on that definition alone, Israel has succeeded. I mean, let's be blunt about it. Gaza no longer exists. It's unlivable. There are Gazans who live there, and they'll be living there for decades. But as an entity, Gaza is ruined. And I fear that people will be living there in 10 cities for years, because you don't rebuild infrastructure and schools and hospitals overnight. And who's going to pay for it? So the lack of red lines means that other actors, the global south, I would really frankly want. Where are states like Indonesia? Where are they? It's the biggest Muslim country on the planet. Now where are they? Where are they making comments, statements? I'm not saying they support what Israel's doing. Where are the Arab countries? And let's be clear, we know where they are. Most of them are in bed with Israel. I mean, this is the problem. There needs to be other nations stepping up. South Africa, Indonesia. I'm open to other options. They need to step up. The time is now.